Hi, I'm Brendan Bushy, and I wanted to do a video now about where we are now, um, and what's coming. I've spent the last year really researching, studying the formation of our country right on through today. And before I jump into this, I just want to make note of what I see as transformations, um, or transitions that have happened in our country over time. And I'll be looking at things that are written. I'm trying to keep focus on the screen. I have something taped up and I have a couple taped things in my hand, but um, so if I'm looking down, it's because I'm not relying on my memory for everything. I'm relying on my notes. So the other thing I want to say before I start is that the last book I read, that one I just finished, is American Theocracy by Kevin Phillips. And it deals with radical religion, oil, and borrowed money. Quite a topic. Really good book. And part of the second part of what I'm going to cover tonight um, comes from my reading of American Theocracy and what that's led me to explore as a result of reading that book. So the first thing I want to say is our country, okay, our country begins the minute the Constitution of the United States is ratified. Prior to that, there is no United States. So if you want to understand where we are now, you have to understand who we are. And who we are begins with ratification. So the first thing that helps us orient ourselves as to who we are is what the Constitution was when it was ratified. And the Constitution, as it was ratified, allowed for slavery. It allowed for second-class citizenship or disenfranchisement of citizens based upon um, gender and property ownership. So the second or the first, the beginning of our country, we did not have a democracy. We had a country that was based upon the Roman Republic before it became an imperial form of government, and it was controlled by the Senate. That's what our founding fathers did for us. And without getting into detail at each phase, the next, and my contention is at the moment it was ratified, it failed. And I'll get into that. The next event that takes place in our story is the Civil War, another period of transition. And we have a civil war because the Constitution was inadequate, because the Constitution was ill-conceived. We get through the Civil War and we go through a period of Reconstruction, which leads us up to World War One. And World War One is a transition period for us because we emerge as a world power, not the world power, but a world power. And uh, following World War One, we have the Great Depression, which was another transition time for us. And that led to a new approach to government. Thanks to Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, our leaders became concerned with what was happening to our citizens and actually providing services to our citizens, something that prior to this, no one was doing. We have the New Deal, we have social programs, uh, such as Social Security, all coming out of the New Deal. And at the time, and I want to emphasize this, the individual tax rate at the time was over 90%. That's not over 90% on your entire income. It was on 90% on income over a certain amount for people who made a certain amount. So most people, the vast majority of people in this country were not affected by that 90% tax rate. The people who were affected by it were the 1% or the 1/10%, the then millionaires in this country. And then we have World War II. Next transition. A couple of things happened in World War II. More than a couple, but the major things, we come out of it not only being a world power, but the leading world power. We come out of it being the most powerful nation that ever existed on the planet Earth. And the reason for that, not the least of the reasons for that, is that we had the atomic bomb. Other countries acquired it not too long after, but at the point World War II ends, we're the only people with it. And we are the most powerful country on the world, both economically and militarily. And we go through a period here in our country of change. We see people, GIs coming back, they're going to college through the GI Bill. Unlike World War I, the GIs coming back weren't abandoned. We gave them the ability to advance, specifically in education, and they did. And we have the beginning of a burgeoning middle class in this country. So that was the next, I think, important event was World War II and the aftermath. And one of the other things in the immediate aftermath, we have the beginning of the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement really gets up to speed in the 60s and 70s. And for me, the next transition point, okay, comes with the election of Bill Clinton and the election of George W. Bush after that. I think is like part one and part two. Clinton and W. Bush together form the next transition period. And then, interestingly enough, I think W, okay, and Donald Trump are responsible for the next transition, which we've had part one of. Part one of was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And part two is the election of Donald Trump in 2024. And I think we're about to enter a phase of our government that is going to change things so dramatically that I don't know that we'll be able to come back. I think we've finally reached a destination point and we're going to realize that, you know, that movie, Dead Man Walking, the people on death row, they were just waiting for their execution dates, but they were considered dead men walking. And to some extent, I think we're dead men walking or dead citizens walking, because I think things are going to change so radically here. After Trump's next inauguration on January 20th, and that's what I want to talk about now. But before I get into that, I want to point out some fundamental changes that have taken place in this country and why I think this last phase is so critical, and exactly how that last phase came about. So I want to go back to the election of Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, who I have no regard for whatsoever, none. take away everything else and look at specific things he did in terms of legislation that he signed off on. And that, I think, is the most important thing to understand about Bill Clinton. The first thing is that he repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. That was initiated, put in place after the Great Depression to prevent another Great Depression. So what Bill Clinton did, and what he has to own, because he was the president and he signed on it, was he repealed, or he enabled the repealing of the Glass-Steagall Act. The legislation that did that was the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. I think I'm pronouncing that correct. The next thing he did that just was part of that process, okay, was the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. And then the next thing he did, which was the final part of that, a three-part legislative process, was the Community Reinvestment Act. Those three things allowed financial institutions and banks to do what they were never allowed to do since the Great Depression. And those all came to a head when W became president. W had an agenda. And what you need to understand about W is that people, the banks and financial institutions in this country got to sort of flex and spread their wings after the legislation that Bill Clinton allowed to be put in place. And that brought us, okay, it brought us to the Great Recession. Right? So when Bush's second term was ending, we were facing another Great Depression. What they called it then was the Great Recession. And what happened, okay, was we reached a point where our economy was free falling. And I want to explain that. That's what this video is about. So that's my whole introduction, and I'm going to get into it right now. Okay. First thing I want to talk about is GDP, gross domestic product. So I have statistics through the end of 2023. And the most interesting thing about these, okay, you want to really understand this, is that manufacturing at the end of 2023 only accounted for 10.3% of our GDP. So what does that mean? Well, back when Eisenhower was president, manufacturing held the #1 spot in terms of accounting for our GDP. Our GDP, the strength of our GDP was first and foremost based upon manufacturing. Now it's slipped to 4th place. So what is now in first place? What's in first place is finance, insurance, real estate, rental, and leasing. What's in first place is contributes more than any other category to our GDP is financial intrigue. It's not like something we made, right? We're no longer a manufacturing leader. We've let our manufacturing go offshore. We've let our support go offshore. We outsource. We're doing all that. Manufacturing has slipped to 4th place. So what's up at top? Finances. This is all because of the legislation Clinton allowed to go down and what happened immediately after his term ends and Bush comes in. What happens is financial institutions run amok. So what are we producing now? More than anything else we're producing. The answer is debt. We are producing debt, and that's the whole idea. The whole reason those financial services are up is because they are enacting policies and procedures that allow us to get ourselves in debt. And I would argue to some extent perpetual debt. So money is being made not by making something and selling it. Money is being made by offering someone a credit card, for instance, and they charge, and then they're going to pay interest on it. Okay, the interest people are paying on credit cards these days is well over 20%. In some instances, it goes up to 40%. There was a time in this country when I was a little boy that you couldn't charge someone 40% interest. If you were doing that, you were considered a loan shark. So that was left to the mob, right? Organized crime. That was for people who couldn't get loans otherwise from legitimate financial institutions. Now the financial institutions themselves have supplanted the mob. They'll give loans and they don't care. If you default, fine, they get to resell it. And there's not just question of giving loans. It's not just credit card and mortgages. It's other games they're playing. Okay, there's all kinds of procedures going on in the stock market. I couldn't even list them. But we produce debt. Debt is not something tangible. And the reason we got to the point we did at the end of Bush's term is we produced debt and there was nothing backing it up. Right? It was all this debt and there was nothing behind it. And that was because when the economy started to go into free fall after W took office, and in his, I guess, his first term when he was pushing for us going into Iraq, which was totally bogus. Okay. The banks were lending money. Right? We were in trouble, but the way they found to lend money was to allow people to refinance. And they could even refinance for more than what their original mortgage was. And in refinancing, they could not only finance enough to pay the original mortgage off, but have tens of thousands of dollars left over, which they then used to run up credit card debt. So, so we just started running up debt on several levels, on personal levels, on business levels, on national levels, just, hey, running amok with debt. And that came to a head when we hit the Great Recession. And Bush was exited out and Obama was elected by overwhelming majority. But for whatever it's worth, and I like Barack Obama, I don't know him, but I want to say I like him personally. I like him personally because I think he's an intelligent man. And I think he's more sincere than some other politicians. I think Bill Clinton was an intelligent man. And I think he was totally insincere. So I don't like Bill Clinton. In fact, I have some animosity toward him, but I don't have animosity toward Barack Obama. I just think Barack Obama was not equipped to do this job. And he blew the majorities he had in the House and Senate. He had it all, and he didn't know what he was doing. The one thing that he didn't do is he didn't go after the financial institutions and the banks in the way we did after the Great Depression. He did some other things, and some of the things he did actually helped the situation, but they didn't change the bedrock our economy was now based on. So our economy today, okay, is 20.7% of it, of our gross domestic product is based upon financial institutions, money lending. That's who we are. And in the grand scheme of things, okay, the other statistic I have this from 2021, so it's not as recent as the 2023 statistic on GDP, but has to do with where we are in terms of other industrialized nations, in terms of manufacturing. What percentage of our GDP is based upon manufacturing? So in the United States, at in 2023, okay, 10.1% of our GDP is based upon manufacturing. Now, to put this in perspective, here are countries ahead of us where manufacturing accounts for more of their GDP. So I'll give you the country and the percentage. So at the top is China, 27.5% of their GDP is based upon manufacturing. After that, South Korea, 25.5%. After that, Japan, 20.9%. After that, Switzerland, 19.1%. After that, Germany, 18.9%. After that, Poland, 17.4%. After that, Austria, 16.9%. After that, Italy, 15.5%. Geez. And we're going down here. After that, Finland, 14.7%. After that, India, 14.4%. After that, Sweden, 13.2%. Now we get to us, 10.1%. And who's below us? Only two industrialized countries are below us. First one would be France at 9% and United Kingdom at 8.7%. What's happening now is China, South Korea, Japan are emerging as the new leaders. There's a transition period here. In terms of world leadership, in terms of economy, those economies, because they're producing real things, have taken over or leading. Something to know. Now, something else happened in this country, and I want to just mention this, okay? Back, I go back to 1950, and I don't have that number right in front of me, but in 1950, the overall wealth was better spread. We had an emerging middle class. So the amount of the overall wealth held by the upper 0.1% or the upper 1% was far less than it is today. So what is it today? And this, I think, it's important to know, okay? And I have this, generally what you have is the top 1% and the top 20% of Americans saw the greatest increase in their share of the overall GDP. Okay, in the last couple of years. So here's how that went. The top 1%, okay, the top 1%, their share of the wealth in 1990, before Clinton, was 17%. It went to 26% in 2022. So what happened was moving from manufacturing is our number one thing in terms of GDP. We went to producing debt, and the top 1%, okay, as of 2022, controlled 26% or own 26% of our GDP or account for it. The next 20%, okay, the share of wealth held by them was 61% in 1990, and now it's 71% in 2022. What this means is between 1990 and 2022, the middle class lost its wealth, okay, because the top 21% of the country had the overwhelming majority of it. And the middle class, okay, it went in 1963, the wealthiest families had 36 times the wealth of middle class families. 36 times. So the wealthiest families in this country had 36 times the amount of wealth as the entire middle class. Okay. But by 2022, the gap increased to 71 times. So the upper percentage of people in this country, okay, the wealth shifted from the middle class to them. And the middle class is all but gone. And then the bottom half, the whole bottom half of the country, okay, the share of wealth held by families in the bottom half, and this again is in 2022, I believe, is 6%. So we have hundreds of millions of people, and all those people combined only account for 6% of the wealth in this country. We have what's becoming, right, almost like a feudal society. You have serfs and you have landed aristocracy. Um, the least, just to recap, the least wealthy 50% of the United States households hold less than 4% of the nation's wealth today, 2024. Racial and ethnic inequalities in wealth are larger than those in income. So in that the lower 50%, people who have even less they have less, and you can determine it, or it's there. If you just look at their race, it explains why. Okay. In 2022, the top 10% of families had an average wealth of $7.73 million, while the next 40% had an average wealth of $644 million. And the bottom 50% had an average wealth of $46,000. So look at the disparity. Okay. And then in 2019, the median wealth of families with a GED, so graduate equivalence diploma, the median wealth was $18,000, while the median wealth for families with an associate degree or certificate was $102,000. So education plays a role here. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is what was happening here during this period in terms of the national debt. Because what I'm saying is that starting with the administration of George W. Bush, going on through, and the next thing that reinforces what happens with George W. is the administration of Donald Trump. And that whole thing I'm calling part one of what's happening right now. Okay. The national debt went up, rising, went from 32% of our GDP. Okay, so 32% of our GDP was equal to the national debt we held at the time. So about a third of our GDP, we had debt. Now it's at 97%. So here's our GDP. Here's all the wealth that we account for. And what about our debt, our national debt? Well, our national debt is almost equal. It's a couple of percentage points below what we're producing. If you were a family with this kind of debt, you'd be living paycheck to paycheck. And you might not make it because one event could bust you. There's no extra space in there. So that's what happened to our national debt. Okay. And then between 20,000, wait, the federal government has run a budget deficit every year since 2001, Bush, with the average annual deficit being 4.9% of GDP. The government spends more money than it receives in taxes and other revenues. Okay. Let me just add a fact here. What happened under Bush was there was a tax cut. Who did it benefit? The upper 1%. What happened under Trump? The second phase of that tax cut. Who did it benefit? The upper 1%. Okay. And those tax cuts, okay, because the only way we have revenue as a country is through taxation. So those tax cuts have raised our national debt by $10 trillion. So our national debt in some 23 years has gone up $10 trillion because of tax cuts that were enacted under George W. Bush and then under Donald Trump. The other thing I want to touch on is the whole idea of inflation. Because we hear a lot about inflation. We certainly heard a lot about it going into the election, and just about everything we heard was bullshit. And even today, there's talking about whether or not the Fed is going to further decrease the prime interest rate. So what is the prime interest rate? The Federal Reserve is our national bank, our capital bank. It sets the prime interest rate. Who is that for? For us? No. The prime interest rate is for banks and financial institutions. They can borrow money from the Fed at whatever the prime rate is, and then they lend it to us at much higher rate. Back when Bush and even under Obama, the prime was dropping to like 0%. So our federal bank, our capital bank was lending money to lenders at 0% interest, and they were lending it to us at much higher interest. Much higher interest. That's where this bullshit GDP comes about, based upon interest, based upon debt. Okay? So what happened after Trump's first term was the Federal Reserve started acting responsibly, which it didn't under, for instance, Alan Greenspan. And they kept the prime interest rate high. And by high, I'm not talking about super high. I'm just saying they kept it up. And our economy started to improve. So whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, the fact is that when the federal interest rate went up, our overall economy improved. I don't care what the price of a loaf of bread was. Not that it's irrelevant, but that's not the indicator of our economy. What's an indicator of our economy has to do with debt and credit, what people are carrying in the way of debt. So that's what happened. And just until just recently, the Fed has refused to lower the interest rate, and then it did. It lowered it a little while ago, and now it's talking of lowering it a little more. Now, the Fed took a position when things were improving, when they were holding the prime interest rate up, when it wasn't zero. They said they were not going to consider reducing it until inflation dropped to 2%. It hasn't dropped to 2%. I think it's at 2.4% or 2.2%, but it's not 2. So they started lowering, the first step in lowering just recently, the prime interest rate when inflation was above 2%. And they're thinking of doing it again. What does all this mean? Like, well, first of all, how much have you heard about this in your average news reporting on the major networks, in major newspapers? Okay. I I had to read books and other things to learn about this stuff. And I'm outraged. It's like, why are we talking about who can use what bathroom? Our country is based on debt. Our economy is based on debt. It's been that way since 2000. It can't go on that way. I don't care what anybody tells you. It cannot go on that way. So what are we doing? In the last year, we've lowered the prime interest rate. What does that do? It makes it easier for banks and financial institutions to borrow money. And what do they do with that? They lend it to us. And what do we do if the prime interest rate goes down far enough? Then the interest on credit cards is going to drop, and we're going to start spending, which is what we did after Bush was elected, what we did when we refinanced homes and got all this bogus money to spend, which wasn't real. Okay, and then we were all in debt and the economy was about to collapse. So what the Fed is doing is now starting to lower it again. And what Donald Trump and what the Republicans are talking about for a program in after he takes office, okay? They're talking about, again, tax reduction, further tax reduction. If they reduce taxes, they reduce income that the government has to fund programs. They can't get that income from any place else. And what used to be a 90% or more income tax rate for people up there after a certain amount of money has dropped, I don't know, 30% around there, 28%, 37%. If they reduce income taxes still more, okay, there's less money to fund the government. And meanwhile, what the Republicans did is with, I believe, with Grover Norquist, who's a nobody. He's not elected to any office, but he started a thing where Republican candidates, if they want to run for office, they need to go and sign a tax pledge that they will not raise taxes once they're in office. They won't vote for tax increases. Now, this is interesting because this creates a static, okay, a static level, percentage level for income for the government. Meanwhile, our population's expanding. So maybe if you had to provide, for instance, schools for X amount of people, now you had to provide schools for X plus amount of people because there's more people. But this static tax position, we're not going to raise taxes. The only implication, the only avenue for people in the government to fund the government is to cut the programs. So we're not running into problems with things like Social Security because funding it's impossible. We're running into it because we're cutting taxes and we're preventing ourselves from having the money to fund those programs. So one of the things they're talking about doing now is tax reduction. The other thing they're talking about, Trump is big on, is lowering the prime interest rate. So reduce the taxes, lower the prime, expand the debt in all areas, personal, business, national. Okay. Now, how are they going to, what's their plan for surviving, for the government surviving, if they accomplish that, if they reduce the taxes and lower the prime interest rate? Well, it's simple. They're going to dismantle the government. And they're talking about that. They're talking about getting rid of the EPA. They're talking about getting rid of the Department of Education. They're talking about getting rid of other departments. Those are vital, whether people understand it or not. They're bureaucracies, and all bureaucracies are screwy in some ways, but they are vital. So you can't get rid of the Environmental Protection Agency and not suffer dire consequences as a result of it. That's just a for instance. Okay, so what are they going to do with when they dismantle government? What's their plan? Who's going to provide those services? Now they're talking about privatization. They've been talking about that for years. We've already seen certain things certainly on a state level. We've seen the privatization of prisons. That's not a good thing. Prisons should not be for-profit institutions. They should be there to protect us and also provide some means, some alternative. Let us be involved with the people who are in prison during the time they're in prison. So when they come out of prison, they can do something, okay, that doesn't result in them committing crime. So privatization is nuts. It always has been. But we've been privatizing not only prisons, we've been privatizing certain services or certain areas that used to be covered by our military. Since when? Or how is it possible to have vital military services not covered by the military? That should be part of the defense budget. Instead, we're inviting people to gouge our citizens in vital areas like national defense and national security. There's also talk of privatizing Social Security. There's talk of getting rid of programs like Medicare. And just to put this in perspective, one of the things that changed since 2000, right? I believe before 2000, health insurance companies could not be for profit. They could only exist if they were nonprofit. Now they're all for profit. So what's going on? The cost of health insurance keeps going up because they got to make a profit. And how do they make a profit? Okay. They make a profit by denying services to people who are on health insurance. That's the simplest thing. Raising health insurance rates. This is how they make their profit. We suffer. So things like education and health, those are vital services, and they should be part of our government's funding. The other industrialized countries have that. We don't. But we're spiraling into debt. Now, if Donald Trump gets to enact some of these things, which I think He's going to because the Senate and the House, which are both controlled by the Republicans, and even the Supreme Court is controlled by the Republicans, I believe they're all into tax cuts. I believe they're all into privatization. So what we're going to see is the final stage of tax cuts. And what that's going to do is it's going to make governing this country prohibitive. And where that leads, I don't know. But I do know that there are, for a long time, there's been a clear desire on the part of the upper 1% to rewrite our Constitution. And I'm not a fan of our Constitution. Our Constitution is so problematic going back to day one. But if you're going to rewrite it, you're going to replace it. And if you're going to replace it, you could replace it with something worse than what we have. So do I think our Constitution should be rewritten? Probably. But not from the perspective of enhancing the wealth of the upper 1% in this country. Our country, our Constitution should be rewritten to ensure equal rights for everybody, a level playing field for everybody, to ensure basic fundamental services for everybody, to make this country safe and healthy, to educate upcoming generations so that we will have people who are able to develop things that we need in order to survive, adapt to changes. That's not what's going on. So I'm real concerned about the whole transition. We're going to complete with Trump's second term, we're going to complete the tax cuts. We're going to dismantle the government. We're going to privatize what used to be government services, what's left of them. And our news media is not informing us. In the last week, every night, the news was covering the story of the United Healthcare CEO who was assassinated by some whack job. And that's a terrible thing. It should have been reported in the news. It shouldn't have dominated the news cycle for days and days and days. That's not the most important thing happening in this country. Not by a long shot. And then talk about the news. ABC has caved into Donald Trump on a threat. He was suing based upon a statement George Stephanopoulos made. ABC should have held out, but ABC is not the only news agency that's catering to Donald Trump at this point. They're all doing it. The stars of Morning Joe, after the election, they went to see Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Everybody's playing up to Donald Trump. They're terrified of him. Now, the other thing he's doing is he's giving us some idea of his concept of what a government should be, who should head it. He's nominating people for key administrative positions, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of this, Secretary of that, people who have no qualifications for those positions. None. Is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. going to make a decision or head up an agency that's going to make a decision as to whether or not we get vaccinated? Really? That doesn't make much sense to me. It doesn't make much sense to me. There needs to be a level of competence, a minimal level of competence in the people who get appointed to key administrative positions. What Trump is doing is he's nominating people who are totally incompetent for those positions. And what we're hearing, right? We're not hearing about GDP. We're hearing about our economy suffering because of illegal aliens. The illegal aliens or people, undocumented immigrants, are not the reason our economy is in trouble. Our economy is in trouble because of what has gone down um, with legislation allowing banks and financial institutions to create vehicles to put us in debt and keep us in debt. It's going down because the wealth is being shifted from the middle class up to the top 1%. That's what needs to be addressed. The illegal, the undocumented immigrants, some of them come here and commit crimes. More of us who are here and who are natural citizens commit crimes than undocumented immigrants. That's not the problem. But they become the scapegoat. And when I was doing my research in this last year, what I see, okay, similar to this progression, I go back to Germany. Germany pre-Hitler. Hitler ran, okay, on a policy of purifying the blood, getting rid of the undesirables in the country that were bringing the country down. Jews, gypsies, people who were members of the Communist Party. So the new scapegoat we have now is undocumented immigrants. They don't affect available housing in this country because they can't afford, they're not competing for houses. So if there's a scarcity of houses, it's not the undocumented immigrants. It could be that our money is worth nothing. And that's the other thing. Since World War II, the international currency, if I can use that, the practical medium of exchange was based upon the US dollar. That's been coming into play. That's looking like it could change, and that will change us. And who's leading that? Those countries, China, Japan, South Korea, those countries that are manufacturing, those countries where the largest portion of their GDP is based upon manufacturing. You haven't heard about any of this? You've heard about whether or not a congressperson from, I guess, New York can use the men's room or the ladies' room in the House? You've heard about that. You heard about the assassination of a CEO heading up a for-profit healthcare company. You've heard about all kinds of things about inflation, but no one's telling you that inflation is going up because we're not producing things anymore. People are telling you inflation is going up because of all kinds of things, undocumented immigrants, uh, out of control government spending. If they start cutting things, they're going to cut across the board a lot of things. If they cut Social Security benefits, I can tell you it's going to impact everybody on Social Security in this country. That's a percentage of our population. I think from some perspectives, those of us who are getting old are not as useful anymore. And if we haven't been lucky enough to be in a situation where we could survive, even with reductions in Social Security, too bad. We're what the Republican Party candidates like Mitt Romney referred to as the takers. So to be clear, I am not a fan of the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party poses the greatest threat to this country at this moment. After that, I think the Democratic Party poses the second greatest threat. And the reason being is that none of the politicians in either party is really addressing the things I've been talking about here. None of them. They're all catering in one fashion or another to the upper 10% or the upper 1% of the wealth holders in this country. So where does that leave us? I have no idea. I have no idea. I got nothing here. It's like, so what's going to be interesting to see is whether or not Trump is going to be able to seat the cabinet that he's recommending now to the Senate. And what our news reporting agencies should be doing is covering that in spades, investigating every one of those people and reporting accurately and honestly on exactly what their histories were, what their qualifications are, what their inclinations are. We're going toward, okay, we're going toward an autocracy combined with a kleptocracy, combined with an idiocracy. The three stools of our future government: stupidity, right? Corruption and class privilege. I don't know. If you're not in the upper 1% of the country, I would be concerned. And I wouldn't get distracted by partisan party rhetoric. Not that there aren't differences, but you know what? They don't amount to that much compared to what I'm talking about here. If we're at each other's throats, we're ignoring what we need to be paying attention to, the people looting our economy. Those are the politicians that we have in office, that we've had in office, and that we're going to continue to have in office unless something changes. And there's only so much you can steal. It's like, what, what happens? What happens when we're all like totally, um, the wealth has just moved? The lower 50% of the people in terms of finances in this country, they got nothing already. The vestige of the middle class, which I'm in that, probably most of you are, we're the ones who are going to lose. So if you're in the upper 1%, you're going to have wealth. But you know, the wealth ain't going to mean a lot if what we've produced is a two-tiered society, wealth and poverty. And the other thing that we're not dealing with, just to round this out, which is the most pressing issue in the world, not just in our country, but it's pressing here, is what we're doing to the environment. We're destroying our ability to survive. That's all I got. Thank you for putting up with me. I hope I'm coherent here. Have a good night. And if you celebrate any or all of the holidays coming up, have a happy holiday. Take care.